they had the opportunity to look in depth at a particular state regulatory process and a particular project that was trying to get permitted. I think especially of interest because it's a local project. Many of you may already be familiar with it or have been involved in the process yourselves in some way. So thank you all for coming, and go ahead, team.
Thank you very much for that introduction. So we're going to start first by introducing ourselves. We are all public policy seniors enrolled in the Practicum project this quarter. My name is Tebello Qhotsokoane, and I'll give you everyone to introduce themselves.
I'm Zach Johnson.
Gabriela Greig.
Vihan, Khanna.
Kirkman.
Thank you very much. So we have spent this quarter looking at specifically the San Francisquito Creek flood control project. And we would first of all like to thank all of the people that have really assisted in the project thus far, the Public Policy Department, Professor Kane, who we talked to very early on in the project, our instructor, Professor Lidvack, and all the people that basically were very generous with their feedback and also really with assisting us through the project as we went. So I'm going to give you the lay of the land today for as far as the presentation and sort of walk you through how we're going to present to you today. So I'm going to start first by discussing by giving you a little introduction into the methodology that we decided to use for the project, as well as a contextualization about why this project particularly matters. And then we're going to move from there to discussing the case background and also performing a case analysis after that. And then from there, we'll talk about the policy alternatives that we came up with and also a list of recommendations, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. So as I said, I'll start. So the approach that we decided to do for the project was a case study. And we did that because during the initial meetings with our client, we thought that that would actually be the very best way to get at understanding the 401 permitting process. And obviously, selecting a case study presents a few limitations. Because it's a case study, it's not thought to be as easily generalizable as far as how can you use most of the things that we learned from this particular case in cases of similar complexity in the future. So to mitigate that, we decided to focus our project precisely on the process, so the 401 process, and map all the things that we learned from the particular cases onto the process so that we could find insights that we could use then for projects that have similar complexity and that also involve many stakeholders as well as regulating agencies. And we did that first by identifying complaints in the process, and then moving from there to then identifying some of the underlying issues that might have led to some of those complaints that we observed. And then from there, we worked on finding the policy alternatives that we could suggest to mitigate some of these underlying issues. And then we projected those public policy alternatives that impacts on the process itself. So how good were they going to be at actually addressing some of the underlying issues and also speeding the process. And then from there, we weighted those alternatives to provide recommendations. And the policy question that we were working under specifically was what lessons can we learn from the JPA flood control project, and how can we then improve the permitting process so that it is effective for both the water board and for applicants alike. And this is a particularly salient topic because with the advent of what's happening right now, for instance, in the meetings that are happening in Paris right now, climate change is at the forefront of what most people are thinking about, and with that is a question of sea level rise. And with sea level rise, then really the onus is on thinking about how you're going to get such complex flood control projects to actually be passed in various other places. So projects of the same complexity as the JPA case are going to become extremely common in this area and many other coastal areas. So it's really important to get the permitting process right there and to actually make sure that those projects go from conception to actual execution at the very end. So I'm going to pass it now to Vihan to give a little background of both the clients that we worked with, so the applicant and the regulator, and also the specific project that we're talking about today.
Thank you very much, Tebello. My name is Vihan. And I'm going to be taking you through a couple of things. First, I'm going to be briefly describing our client, which was the water board, the water board of the San Francisco Bay region. Next, I'm going to be briefly talking about the applicant, which was the San Francisquito Creek Joint Powers Authority, and henceforth we're going to just refer to them as JPA for short. Finally, I'm going to be talking about what the flood control project itself was, and then take you briefly through what the 401 certification process looks like in theory. Next slide. So the way California's water board system is organized very briefly is that we have one state water resources control board at the top that figures out, that plans with regional water boards the strategic plans for the state and how the state intends to use its water over the future. And then you have 9 regional water resources control boards. And each of these regional boards plays an integral role in figuring out the strategy for water security in the future. So you have the state divided up according to San Francisco Bay, North Coast, Central Coast, Los Angeles, etc. And our client was the first one, which was the San Francisco Bay. So here are the responsibilities of the water board, briefly, the regional water board. First of all, it's to develop strategic plans that protect the state water and its many users. Secondly, it's to issue permits for projects that impact the state's waters. Third of all, it's to implement the state basin plan, which is the overall strategy of what the regional board wants to do. And finally, it's to enforce compliance, especially when applicants are violating laws. Go to the next slide. So the applicant itself was the SSCJPA. The JPA was formed after flooding occurred due to El Nino in 1998. We had $26 million worth of property damages that occurred along the San Francisquito Creek. And so these agencies joined together to coordinate future flood control and watershed management projects. What are these agencies? It's a composition of 3 cities, Palo Alto, East Palo Alto, and then the Park, as well as the Santa Clara Valley Water District and San Mateo County Flood District. What's really interesting is the fact that all these agencies are very diverse. They have different kinds of incomes, different kinds of power amongst the government, and it's been a fascinating thing to learn about during the process of this case. Go to the next slide. Now briefly, this is what the flood control project aimed to improve the flood walls, increase levees, and essentially deal with flood control. The idea behind it was that there's projected sea level rise over the next 50 years. And there's also the risk of flooding due to tides coming from tides relate fluvial flooding as well as flooding due to tides. Sorry about that, that's a mouthful. The project has a couple of secondary benefits outside of flood control, which includes improvements to wildlife and marshes, as well as safer and newer PG&E gas pipelines, as well as improved bait trails. Now briefly, I want to take you through what the 401 certification process looks like in theory. The 401 permit comes up in conjunction with a 404 permit from the Army Corps of Engineers. The 404 permit is related to dredging projects. So whenever there is material either being taken out of water or being put into water, that necessitates a 404 permit. And consequently, in conjunction with the 404 permit, oftentimes applicants need to get a 401 permit. Now the 401 permit itself is focused on protecting wetlands, as well as making sure that the project alternative that is chosen is the least environmentally damaging project alternative, which we'll henceforth refer to as LEFA for short. In theory, if you can go back, in theory, the process starts with an application being received by the Regional Water Board. This application is then checked for completeness. After this, there's a public notice period where the public can comment on the project. Next, the project is evaluated according to state laws. After that, it's evaluated according to the basin plan, which as I mentioned before, is the strategic plan of the Regional Water Board. Finally, the Regional Water Board needs to decide how to mitigate any environmental damages that occur. So it does this in conjunction with the Department of Fish and Game, the Army Corps of Engineers, as well as this U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And together, they try to figure out what collectively is the best and least environmentally damaging project alternative. And finally, you have the application either being certified or denied. So having gone through all that in theory, I'm going to hand it over to Trey to talk more about what the case looked like in reality.
Yeah, one minor amendment, that's state and federal laws.
Sure.
Yeah,
Yes.
because NEPA is
Thank you.
federal.
Thanks, Vihan. So my name's Trey Kirkman. I'm going to walk you through a little bit of what this case actually looked like in practice. One thing we found throughout our project is that there's lots of competing narratives about what actually took place in this case, and so focusing specifically on the process and going through document analysis was really invaluable to us to try to figure out exactly what was happening and try to look at structural mechanisms to then solve that. So as we see, the JPA was formed just before the turn of the century in response to El Nino flooding, and between then and '08 there was lots of kind of informal project planning and lots of conversations between the JPA and various stakeholders, but in '08 we kind of marked that as the beginning of formal plans to actually start the process, because that's when they hired their first technical consultants to start doing analysis on different project design alternatives, and then in 2010 to 2012 they began working on their environmental impact report, which is integral in the creation of what they deem to be the LEDPA for that particular project design. And then finally, the actual application, the first application is submitted March 12, 2013, and that, while this seems like a long timeline, this is just really the pre-application period, and it looks relatively standard, though there's some issues there, but in the second half of the timeline is where we really see things start to break down and things start to lengthen. So if we can go next slide. So I'm not going to go through all of these points because you didn't come here to see a timeline. But the main thing to note here is that this is a 2-year gap between when the very first application was submitted and then when they finally received a conditional certification from the Water Board. So in between here, you'll see a couple different cycles of the application being deemed incomplete or being denied without prejudice, basically due to a series of recurring issues with the technical specifications of the project and assumptions therein, the LEDPA selection for the project, and a host of other factors that the Water Board felt were never adequately answered over a series of different project revisions.
Did they have to go to the Army Corps of Engineers at the same time, or is that sequential?
So that's actually, so basically the way, and I'll get to this in the next slide a lot too, is that, so I can actually come to it now. One of the things the Water Board does is it acts as a sort of a coordinating body, because out of a lot of, there's a lot of impetus for these various regulatory agencies, whether it's Army Corps of Engineers, the Water Board, Fish and Wildlife, et cetera, to reduce kind of overhead by collaborating as opposed to having a bunch of siloed operations. So, you know, in this case, they apply for a 404 permit and then the 401 simultaneously, but as there seem to be a lot of issues with the 401 certification process, a lot of the other regulatory agencies sort of took the foot off the gas, so to speak, waiting to see what happened that came out of that, because they didn't want to put a bunch of resources towards a project that then would not be certified in its current state from the Water Board. And so another key moment here is when the application is denied without prejudice in February 2014, the JPA files for an appeal of the decision and writes a very strongly worded letter detailing their issues with the process to this point, which then a couple months later leads to a good faith agreement between the two entities to work towards a mutually beneficial arrangement and resolution of the case. And then finally, after some board involvement in August of that year, or sorry, the board members of the Water Board, it's a little bit complicated, that eventually leads to a conditional certification agreement pending the Army Corps of Engineers issuing their public notice, which is another aspect of the 401 process, which is then issued December 18th of that year, and then the following April, they issue a conditional certification, which I should note still includes a lot of the same issues and concerns that the Water Board had raised in other parts of the process, and so it doesn't necessarily clearly constitute a resolution of those issues. And so I want to walk you through a little bit of the problems that specifically take place in this case, and then I'll pass it off to Zach, where he can really go through how we tried to think about what those surface level issues meant in terms of underlying problems that could be addressed through policy alternatives. So one of the main ones is the technical disputes, which I've mentioned pretty consistently throughout this. These technical disputes, whether they were the types of technical analysis that needed to take place, or the technical assumptions made within the case, or like the lack of sediment conveyance analysis was a very big sticking point. There's a lot of friction and distrust between the two parties along with ACTIS, and a lot of it goes back to a switch in technical consultants midway through the project planning cycle. So the original consultants, PWA consultants, were very well respected by the water board, but then the second set of consultants, HDR, they felt they didn't have the same level of savvy when it came to large, complex projects such as this. As I mentioned, the lead post selection was also a main issue. The board wondered why there was not a series of other alternatives that should have been heavily considered that had more to do with the golf course and the airport, the Palo Alto airport. However, the JPA felt that was a land use issue, and they had already done a lot of stakeholder work to try to figure out whether or not that was on the table, and whether that was actually a practicable alternative, and they felt it was not. Application completeness is a big one, because, as I mentioned, there's this point where the application is deemed incomplete, and this is a point that really sparks a lot of distrust from the JPA, because they had been under the impression that their application had already been deemed complete, and were waiting for certification, and so there seems to be some miscommunication around that issue. I mentioned interagency coordination already, which the JPA started to take as not necessarily in good faith, as things went along. And then finally, the weighing of stakeholder interests. There's a lot of debate about, from the water board's perspective, how much stakeholders were considered in the process of choosing the project design, especially how many environmental groups in the region were actually consulted and made aware of the project. And then the JPA wondering to what extent the water board should be considering those more political factors of the case in their evaluation. So that's kind of the service level issues, and then I want to pass it over to Zach so he can talk a little bit about the underlying issues of the case.
I just want to interject real quickly. Sorry. What I think you meant to say was that one of the issues that happened was that the application was deemed complete, but thereafter the water board asked for more information. So that was the issue. The issue was that the applicant thought that having a complete application meant that there's no need for more information, but actually that's not the case. So that was where a little bit of the miscommunication and distrust arose.
Okay, so now that we're a little bit past the midpoint of our presentation, I'm going to do a quick recap because we're throwing a lot of information at you, and sometimes we take it for granted that we've been working with this information for like 10 weeks plus Thanksgiving break. So we're gonna go back for a sec. We have an applicant, the JPA, who's trying to get a flood control project off the ground. They need the 401 permit from the regulator, the water board. And Trey just mentioned a lot of problems we saw in the process of trying to complete the application and also an application review. And so after we as a team identified those problems, we asked the question, what are the underlying issues? What are the fundamental root causes of these surface level problems? And we identified some. The three biggest underlying issues we identified are communication, roles and expectations, and distrust. Starting with communication, we saw a lapse in communication between both parties in the situation, and we believe that this generated a lot of confusion and erroneous assumptions, which led to a lot of those surface level problems. Specifically, the problems we think it led to were problems with the application revision. The water board would ask the JPA to revise a certain part of their application or provide some new information, and for whatever reason, some miscommunication, the JPA would not provide the information that the water board wanted. Another example would be the review process. After the JPA's application was submitted, they felt like they weren't being talked to enough. They didn't know where their application stood during the review process, which took quite a while. The next underlying issue we identified was roles and expectations, and this one, especially when talking to the water board very recently, was the one that really hit home for them. No roles or expectations were really defined in the process. So what that means is neither party vocalized what they thought their role throughout the entire process would be, and also their expectations for the process. And what we identified in that underlying issue is that when these things are not clearly defined at the beginning of the process, that it can generate a lot of conflict when the expectations that they have but don't vocalize are not met. And so some examples of that in this was this problem with overstepping, where the water board thought that they were helping the JPA by reaching out to other agencies, whereas the JPA believed the water board was overstepping its bounds in order to further its own agenda. So our last major underlying issue is distrust. This is distrust of the JPA, or by the JPA of the water board. And to define distrust a little bit better, it's distrust in the sense that the JPA thought that a lot of the water board's actions were inspired by less than ideal motivations. So some examples of this distrust would be problems with cooperation, specifically, again, the water board reaching out to other agencies, but the JPA not being willing to work with them in that sense because they didn't trust their intentions. And so now that we have identified these major underlying issues, we also wanted to take a quick moment to talk about a few other underlying issues we identified. The reason we have relegated these to non-major underlying issues are because we think they're a little bit less flexible, a little bit less correctable, but we do think they were likely present nonetheless. So some examples are inherent conflict between applicant and regulator, resource constraints for both applicant and regulator, the permit process learning curve. This was the first time the JPA had gone through the 401 permit process, and it proved to be a huge learning curve, very steep. Also unique project elements. Not all water projects have to also involve things like airport land and golf course land, just further complicated everything. And then last, project complexity. They pulled many, although the water board has experience with really complex projects, there's no telling what agencies may be needed and how different stakeholders might respond to different stimuli. So now, after we identified all of these underlying issues, specifically those major ones, communication, roles and expectations, and distrust, we decided to use those underlying issues to design our alternatives. The policy alternatives we think will best address underlying issues and therefore hopefully stop problems from occurring before they even rise to the surface. And so before we jump into the policy alternatives themselves, I want to introduce you to our evaluative criteria. The criteria we use to evaluate each alternative and ultimately use that to decide what we think the recommendations should be. So we have 4 evaluative criteria. Improvement to speed, which is how does this alternative enhance the speed of the process, if at all. We have feasibility, and we break this down into operational, legal, and also political. Operational meaning how well does this alternative fit into the water board's daily goings-on. Legal, straightforward, and then political. With the current political landscape, will this alternative make sense? Next, monetary cost of the water board, which is straightforward. And finally, monetary cost to the applicant, specifically in the application process. And then we have a nice little color legend, which hopefully is legible. Screen's a little lighter than we expected, but I think it'll work. So our first alternative is the formal pre-app feedback system. And what this is it would be a monthly or semi-regular meeting hosted by the water board, also potentially including other agencies that might be involved in the permit process. And the water board would invite applicants or people thinking of applying to come, get feedback about their projects, start that line of communication early, start off a relationship with one of trust and one of help. Another example of this formal pre-app feedback system could be an intent to apply form. So an applicant, somebody thinking of applying, could submit this form with a basic overview of their project and get some feedback on it early on so they don't invest a lot in a project that might not make sense. For the rest of these alternatives, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Gabby.
Okay, thanks, Zach. So now you've heard one of our policy alternatives, and I can walk you through the next 5. So the first is this board oversight mechanism, and this stems from the disconnect that we saw between what the process should look like that Vihan showed you, and then what the process actually looked like. So all these deviations from that smooth process to a project application or a permit application getting accepted. There were all these requests for more information. The application was denied without prejudice. It was deemed incomplete at times. So when these kind of repeated problems occur, this should trigger the board members of the water board to work with the applicant more closely to address any of those concerns and get the process back on track as quickly as possible. And we think that this would help eliminate any unnecessary back and forth over technical differences and improve trust, because the applicant would know that board members of the board are of the water board are invested in their projects specifically, or trying to get these complex projects to be completed successfully, and this would have maybe some legal issues that we would have to think about because of ex parte laws that limit the communication that water board members can have with board members can have with their applicants, but that nevertheless, I think this is something that we should definitely consider because it would improve process
So
speed
you
quite
do
a bit.
need board members as opposed to staff, right?
Board members then driving the staff to kind of address those problems more quickly. So working together.
Yes.
Yes.
Board
Yes.
Board members.
Well, I mean, there's a big difference, and
Yes.
I
No,
know
I
you
know.
know
Yeah.
that this is a big issue that,
Yes.
well, we'll get to it later.
Next, we have a set of technical guidelines. So the water board mentioned to us that about 10% of their projects are as technically complex as this JPA case. So we think for those projects specifically, it would be really helpful to have some sort of clear communication on what is expected in terms of technicality for the applicant. So this could look like a FAQ sheet, this could look like examples of successful projects with similar levels of technical complexity, so that the roles and expectations of what the applicant needs to submit are clearly outlined from the very beginning. So the key here is that early communication, and there would be a low cost for initially providing that kind of list or FAQ sheet, but overall we think that that would play out really well in the long run. Next, we have the early involvement of technical staff. So each project does get assigned a case manager, but one thing that the water board relayed to us was that there were often problems with the very specific technical people, so people who were working on the hydraulic analysis or were specific fish and wildlife people weren't always available right from the very beginning to mitigate any of those technical concerns that the two parties had. So this would just mean that the water board should offer their technical assistance very early on and have those experts available. And then, of course, this would increase communication, early communication in particular, and increase trust through that as well. There, again, is some cost in terms of staff resources, to involving more staff members at an earlier point in the process, but we do think that this would improve speed quite a bit. Next, we have an online application submittal and tracking system. So if there's one place, one online portal where the applicant could submit their application, the water board could respond, you could bring in any other permitting agencies such as the Army Corps of Engineers. There would be a clear log of all the communication, requests for more information, and then the applicant could respond to those requests more quickly. It would all be in one place, so there would be greater transparency, and that transparency would then impact the trust in the process in a very positive way, because there would be no questions of who was asking for what information or when that was requested. And then it would just allow for closer communication overall between all of the parties. There is a significant cost to putting this online application system together and then maintaining it, but in the long run we think that this would just really centralize and organize all of the communication that the two parties would have. And then finally, on a related note, an updated website would help. We know that we had some trouble sifting through all of the very technical documents that were on the water board website, so having some clarity in that, having a place where applicants can go where they know that all of the information that they're going to need is involved. Again, maybe some of those examples of successful projects or an FAQ section. Overall, just making the website more intuitive and more clear would help both the public and any applicants, really anyone looking at the water board, to understand better what is required, and would increase the water board's clear communication with anyone looking at their website. Again, significant cost to putting this together, and then continuing to update the website as maybe some technical problems arise, but we do think that it is a feasible alternative as well. So those were the 6 alternatives that we thought through and then evaluated.
Gabby, because of the
Oh, yeah.
the evaluative ranks weren't very legible, do you think you could, I think you have like an outcomes matrix
We
somewhere
do,
in
yeah.
front. Maybe you could just bring that up for a minute so that everybody could look at that. And if you want to say
It's like
something
the
about it,
last
that's fine.
slide.
I know that you're about to say something, that relates to that, but
Right.
I think if they could,
Yeah, so this also is a little small, and we have copies.
which
We
is
have-
why they had the other.
We have physical copies for you. This is
Okay.
kind of going to be an appendix slide, but you can kind of look through alternatives and see that, you'll see in a minute how we evaluated our recommendations, or came up with our recommendations from the policy alternatives, but we have the order of improvement to speed, so you have, all of our alternatives that we came up with are excellent or good. The cost is the one with the most variation, but there is, for none of these alternatives, is there a cost for the application itself. Obviously, there's a cost for doing the project, but we don't think that this would add additional cost for the applicants. And then the feasibility is also ranges from like excellent to good. There are a couple instances like the legal issue in the board oversight mechanism where there are some other little differences, but we've tried to go over some of those. So Tebello can tell you more about how we actually evaluated all of those policy alternatives and came up with our recommendations.
Great. So as part of the project, we had to come up with a list of recommendations that we had to present to the board after doing all of the work and sort of brainstorming. So these are the three. We decided on three eventually, but how we came to those three was we looked at each of our policy recommendations, and then we assessed them on their direct effect to the underlying issues that we outlined, and then also their impact on process speed. And then we also looked at prohibitive factors such as monetary cost, as well as feasibility of implementation, whether it's due to legal constraints that actually make that impossible to implement. And after considering all these, we decided on the three recommendations, which were the formal pre-application feedback system, the board oversight mechanism, and then the set of technical guidelines. And all of these ranked very highly on improvement to process speed, but also were not as costly, which are the things that we really looked at. And we think that the other recommendations that we did not list here are still important and actually worth considering, but might be worth considering in the long run because of the high upfront costs to the water board. So these are the three that we decided to prioritize. Yes, so thank you very much for your time and attention, and also for the opportunity to practice this. As public policy students, this work was immensely rewarding for us because we got to really learn about the public sector and how it functions, and sort of looking at regulation policy, something that was very meaningful, I think, for all of us. So thank you very much for the opportunity to do this, and also for your attention this afternoon. It's been quite a great 10 weeks, and we really, really enjoyed it a lot. And we now are going to open it up for questions.
So I'm gonna keep up the recommendations.
Okay.
So let's take them one at a time here. What's the value of the pre-app meeting? This is just with the State Water Resources Control Board, so even though you have to deal with BCBC, even though you have to deal with Fish and Wildlife, even though you have to deal with the engineers, the only people you're going to talk to are the State Water Resources Control Boards. And yet in your presentation, you told us that they were not trusted.
So actually, this formal pre-app feedback system does in fact include other agencies. It'd be an interagency meeting. It's actually based off of a very similar meeting that the Army Corps of Engineers has implemented with a lot of success. We spoke to the Water Board about this system, and while they have something a little bit similar, they were really excited to hear about this. They think it's definitely something that's a positive recommendation, and the goal of this is to really